The morning light slipped through the thin curtains of our small apartment in Logan Square, painting pale gold lines across the cracked white walls. Outside, the distant rumble of the Blue Line echoed like a tired heartbeat of the city. Inside, everything was quiet, too quiet, but the smell of scrambled eggs and bacon filled the kitchen with a warmth that almost felt comforting. Almost. I stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, flipping the eggs slowly the way Dylan liked them. Soft, no brown edges, just enough salt, just the way I had learned to make them over the past 2 years of marriage. 2 years of waking up before him. 2 years of molding my routine around his schedule. 2 years of shrinking myself into a version of me that barely resembled the woman I once was. The coffee machine beeped softly. I poured his favorite dark roast into the chipped ceramic mug he had bought when he first moved to Chicago. Back when he was still dreaming. Back when his eyes used to light up when he talked about the future, our future. I placed the plate gently on the small dining table, aligning the fork just right the way he liked it. It was a habit now, a ritual, one I performed even when my heart felt heavier than my hands. The bedroom door opened. Dylan stepped out freshly showered, dressed in a crisp navy blue shirt and tailored black slacks. His expensive cologne drifted ahead of him before his words ever did. He adjusted his cufflinks as he walked his reflection in the hallway mirror, catching his attention longer than mine ever did. He glanced at the table. "Scrambled eggs again," he said flatly. No good morning, no smile, no warmth. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table for a second, before I forced a small smile onto my face. "I thought you liked them," I said softly. "Yesterday you said they were good." He pulled out the chair and sat down, scrolling through his phone as if I were invisible. Just because they're good doesn't mean I want the same thing every day. "Elena, people at the office eat better than this. Avocado toast, smoked salmon, cold brew from real cafes. This." He gestured lazily at the plate. "This makes me look broke. Look broke." The words landed quietly, but they cut deep. I nodded like I always did. "I'm sorry." He took a bite as if it were a chore he had to get through, before chasing the version of himself he paraded at work. I sat across from him with my tea untouched, watching the steam rise and disappear, wondering when exactly my life had started to feel like this. Dylan worked at Rivera Holdings, the company he bragged about constantly, the company he believed was the peak of his existence, the company he was clawing his way to the top of, with ambition so sharp it sometimes scared me. What Dylan didn't know, what he had never known, in the 2 years we had shared a roof, a bed, and countless silences, was that Rivera Holdings belonged to me. I was Elena Rivera, the only daughter of Antonio Rivera, the sole heir, the CEO. And every morning I sat in that tiny Logan Square apartment, pretending I was nothing more than a bookstore clerk, married to a man who was slowly beginning to despise me. When Dylan finished eating, he stood barely touching the rest of his food. "I'm heading out," he said, already fixing his tie. "Drive safe," I whispered. The door shut behind him. Silence rushed back in like a tide. I stared at his half-eaten breakfast for a long moment before carrying it to the sink. The untouched eggs slid into the trash, heavy and cold. Something inside my chest sank with them. I looked at my reflection in the small kitchen window. Faded robe, tired eyes, hair loosely tied, a woman who looked like she had been forgotten by her own life. This version of me wasn't who I was born to be, but it was the woman I had chosen to become. Because once, just once, I had trusted a man with my real identity. And it almost destroyed me. Years ago, before Logan Square, before the tiny kitchen, before Dylan, I lived in a glass mansion overlooking Lake Michigan. My name was on business magazines. Photographers waited outside charity galas. I wore dresses that cost more than most people's cars. I was surrounded by men who smiled too much and looked at my last name before they ever looked at my face. Then I met Ethan, handsome, charming, sweet in the way that made you believe every word he said was carved just for you. He talked about love like it was sacred, about marriage like it was a destiny. He loved my laugh, my strength, my independence, or so I thought. The gifts he asked for started small: a watch, a vacation, a car. Then came the condo he wanted for our future, the business investment he said would benefit both of us. I gave him everything because I wanted to believe in him more than I wanted to believe the warnings. 1 week before our wedding, I overheard him. He was on the phone with his best friend laughing. "Of course I'll marry her," he said. "Once it's official, half of Rivera Holdings is basically in my hands. After that, we do whatever we want. A boring woman like that is only good for one thing: money." My world collapsed in complete silence. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming, no tears in front of him. I canceled the wedding that same night. I erased him from my life, and I erased myself from the world that had made me a target. I told my board I was stepping away from the spotlight. I handed temporary control to executive management. I disappeared from public view. I became Elena Cruz, a name no one cared about, a woman no one wanted for her money. That was how I met Dylan. He walked into the small bookstore near DePaul University, looking for a marketing book he couldn't pronounce properly. He was awkward, ambitious, nervous. His hands trembled when he talked about making it big in Chicago. And for the first time in my life, a man looked at me without seeing Rivera first. When he said he loved me, I believed it. When he proposed, I said yes. When I asked him to consider leaving Rivera Holdings before we married, just as a test of whether he cared more about me than status, he refused without hesitation. But I married him anyway, because I wanted to believe that love could exist without last names and glass towers. 2 years later, I was watching the man I married turn into someone I barely recognized. Dylan no longer looked at me when he spoke. He no longer invited me to gatherings. He gave me a strict allowance for groceries, even though his salary had tripled. Sometimes he came home past midnight, smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. And every time I asked if something was wrong, he smiled and said, "You wouldn't understand." He wasn't entirely wrong, because the truth was, I understood too much. The following evening, Dylan came home earlier than usual. He was smiling, really smiling. He even brought home donuts from a trendy shop in West Loop, the kind he once said was overpriced nonsense. My heart lifted just a little. Against my better judgment, hope stirred. "I got promoted," he said proudly. "Senior manager. The Rivera Annual Gala is this weekend. Big event, investors, directors, the whole city." I congratulated him, my voice trembling with something that felt like joy, but tasted like fear. And he added, pulling a sleek envelope from his bag, "You're coming with me." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The Rivera Gala, my father's gala, my company's night. He finally wanted to take me into his world. Then he sat down across from me and looked me up and down like a stranger. "There are a few conditions." The word tightened something around my heart. "You need to wear something plain, dark colors, no jewelry. Don't try to stand out." My fingers curled into my palms. "And don't talk too much. Especially not to the executives. You wouldn't get their world. I don't want you embarrassing me." I swallowed, and at the event he said quietly, leaning forward, "Don't act like my wife." The air disappeared from the room. "If anyone asks, you're just someone distant, a relative. Understand?" I nodded, because that's what I had learned to do. That night, while Dylan slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. Then I got up, and I made a call. On the screen appeared the face of Miguel Alvarez, the man who had stood beside my father for decades. The only person inside Rivera Holdings who knew I was still alive in its shadows. "I'm going to the gala," I told him, as a guest. His expression darkened. "You shouldn't have to endure that." "I need to," I said, "because I need to see how far he's willing to go." There was a long silence between us. "Prepare everything," I whispered, and when I returned to bed beside the man who had just erased me from his life with a single sentence, I realized something had shifted inside me. The woman who used to endure quietly was beginning to disappear, and something else was waking up in her place. Something colder, something dangerous. If you think this is just the story of a husband who underestimated his wife, then stay with me, because this is only the beginning. And what he does to me at that gala will change everything. The days after Dylan told me about the gala passed in a strange suspended quiet. On the surface, everything looked the same. I made breakfast, I cleaned, I went to the bookstore. I came home before him most nights and pretended not to notice the growing distance between us. But underneath, something had already fractured. I watched Dylan more closely than before, not with suspicion alone, but with clarity. That week, he stopped asking what I did during the day. He stopped pretending to listen when I spoke. His conversations became shorter, his patience thinner. When I told him we were running low on groceries, he sighed like I had asked for something unreasonable. When I mentioned the rent increase our landlord had hinted at, he snapped that I should learn to manage better. Yet every night I saw new purchases appear in our home. A gold watch box on the dresser, a pair of Italian shoes in the closet, a tailored blazer that cost more than my entire month at the bookstore. For himself, there was always more. For me, there was always just enough. Once, while folding his laundry, a folded receipt slipped from his pocket. A bar in River North, 2 cocktails, 1 dessert, 2 credit card swipes within minutes of each other. The date matched a night he had told me he was working late with the team. I stared at the paper for a long time before quietly dropping it into the trash. Not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of pretending not to see what was already carving its shape into my life. On Wednesday afternoon, Madison's name surfaced again. Dylan hadn't mentioned her directly. He didn't need to. He walked into the apartment, talking loudly on the phone. his laugh lighter than I'd heard it in months. When he passed me still barefoot in the kitchen, he didn't look at me once. "Yeah, you killed that presentation today," he said warmly. Seriously, even the VP was impressed. "No, I'm not surprised. You always know how to make an impact." I stood there still holding a knife over half-chopped onions. After he hung up, I asked quietly, "Good meeting today." "Yeah," he replied, loosening his tie. "Madison and I closed that account. She's sharp, knows how to play the game." Play the game. I tasted the words in my mind. That night, he stayed on his phone long after we got into bed. His screen glowed between us like an invisible wall. When I rolled over my shoulder, brushed his arm, he flinched. "Can you not?" he muttered. "I've got emails." "Emails?" I turned away without a word. The silence between us grew wide enough to breathe in. 2 nights before the gala, Dylan laid the dress expectations out more clearly. We were in the living room. He sat on the couch scrolling through his phone, while I pretended to read my eyes drifting over the same sentence again and again. "Show me what you're thinking of wearing," he said without looking up. I hesitated, then brought out the one black dress I had bought months ago from a thrift store near Pilsen. It was simple, long sleeves, no shape to it, not ugly, not beautiful, just invisible. He nodded approvingly. "Good, that's fine." Only that I asked. Yes, no jackets with color, no heels too loud, and no jewelry. I lifted my wrist slightly. "Not even this." He glanced at my inexpensive watch and shrugged. "That's fine. It doesn't really count as jewelry. Doesn't really count." The words curled around something tender inside me. "There will be a lot of people there," he continued. "High-level directors, investors, people who matter. I need everything to be clean, perfect." "I understand," I replied quietly. "And remember," he added, finally looking directly at me, "you're not to introduce yourself as my wife. If anyone asks, you're just related, distantly." My chest tightened, but my voice didn't break. "Why, for my image," he said bluntly. "This world is calculated. First impressions are everything, and before you get emotional, this is for our future too, our future." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. That night I lay awake beside him again. This time I didn't stare at the ceiling. I watched his face as he slept, the strong jaw, the relaxed mouth. The man I once believed would never lie to me. The man who had sworn vows with hands trembling, not from fear but from promise. And I wondered when exactly those promises had expired. The following day at the bookstore, I found myself unable to focus, words blurred, customers' voices sounded distant. My body was present, but my mind was somewhere else, already standing inside the ballroom at the Drake, already watching a moment I couldn't yet see, but somehow felt approaching. Late in the afternoon, a woman walked into the store wearing a red coat that caught everyone's attention. Madison. I knew it was her before she ever spoke. She didn't recognize me at first. Why would she? To her, I was merely a quiet woman who sold books for a living. She browsed the romance section lazily, her phone tucked between her shoulder and ear. "Yes, the gala is this weekend," she said smoothly. "He's bringing a date, but honestly, that won't last." My fingers trembled as I rearranged books nearby. "I already told you," she continued, smiling slightly. "Men like him don't climb forever with dead weight attached." Dead weight. She turned the corner and nearly collided with me. "Oh, sorry," she said quickly, her eyes scanning me without real interest. "Didn't see you there." "It's fine," I replied calmly. She grabbed a random book paid and left. The air in the store felt heavier after she walked out. That evening, I didn't confront Dylan. I didn't accuse him. I didn't cry. I cooked dinner as usual. I listened as he talked about how intense the marketing floor had become since Madison joined his team, how competitive everything was now, how he needed to stay sharp. When he finally went to bed, I waited until his breathing deepened before slipping into my hidden workspace. The bookshelf slid aside with a soft click. Behind it was the life I had abandoned. The laptop, the documents, the encrypted access to Rivera Holdings' internal systems, the one thing I had never truly let go of. I called Alvarez again. "I ran into her today," I told him. "Madison," he said immediately. Yes, there was a pause on the line. "This is no longer just emotional," he said quietly. "This is strategic for them." "I know," I replied. "Are you sure you're ready for what's coming?" he asked. I looked at my reflection in the dark monitor screen. Tired eyes, steady gaze. "I've been ready for a long time," I said. On the night before the gala, Dylan prepared with more care than he ever had for our anniversary. His suit hung on the closet door like a badge of victory. He polished his shoes himself. He rehearsed his introductions aloud in the mirror. I watched him from the doorway. "You seem nervous," I remarked gently. "This is my breakthrough," he said without hesitation. "You don't get what this means for me." I watched his reflection smile proudly at itself. No, I understood exactly what it meant to him. The morning of the gala arrived wrapped in stillness. For the first time in weeks, Dylan didn't criticize my breakfast. He barely ate at all. His fingers trembled slightly as he checked the time again and again. He showered twice. And I stood in the doorway with my borrowed black dress folded over my arm, feeling like I was preparing for a trial rather than a celebration. As he reached for his jacket, he stopped. "One more thing," he said quietly. "At the event, keep your distance from me. I'll be busy networking. Just stay near the food area or something. Don't cling." I nodded. "I won't," I said. But something inside me already knew. Clinging had never been my crime. That evening, as we left the apartment together, the hallway lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. For just a moment, our shadows stretched on the walls. His tall and confident mine smaller and quieter. Two versions of the same future walking in opposite directions. Dylan walked ahead of me down the stairs without looking back. And for the first time, I didn't rush to catch up. I followed at my own pace, because somewhere deep inside me, a part of myself had already reached the place he would never understand. And I was no longer afraid of what waited there. The elevator mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. Plain black dress, no jewelry, hair tied back neatly just the way he wanted. My face was bare, stripped of anything that might draw attention. I looked invisible, exactly as Dylan had instructed. The soft hum of the elevator carried us upward inside the Drake Hotel, surrounded by strangers dressed in silk satin and tailored suits that whispered wealth with every movement. Dylan stood beside me, straight-backed and restless, his fingers adjusting his cuffs again and again, as if perfection might slip away if he didn't hold it tightly enough. He didn't look at me once, The doors opened. Laughter spilled into the corridor like a wave of warm noise. Crystal chandeliers lit the hallway in gold. The scent of expensive perfume and champagne coated the air. This was Rivera's world, my world, the ballroom where I once walked beside my parents, where my name had once been spoken with admiration. Tonight I entered it as a shadow. Dylan stepped out first, his posture changing instantly. Confidence rolled into his shoulders as if someone had flipped a switch. I followed 3 steps behind, just as he had ordered. At the entrance, he handed his keys to the valet with a careless flick of his wrist. The valet glanced at me once briefly, probably deciding whether I was a girlfriend or an assistant or something less important than either. Dylan walked ahead without slowing. Inside the ballroom, everything dazzled. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling like a frozen constellation. White linens draped over round tables, each decorated with fresh lilies and gold-rimmed glassware. A jazz band played softly near the stage, their music weaving through conversations like a velvet ribbon. Executives, directors, investors, all gathered under one roof, all unknowingly standing inside my house. Dylan turned toward me just long enough to issue his final command. "Stay near the buffet. Don't wander. Don't talk to people unless spoken to," he murmured, "and don't do anything foolish." Then he vanished into the crowd, just like that. I stood still for a moment, feeling the absence of him more loudly than his presence ever had. Then I walked to the corner near the food tables as instructed, and picked up a glass of orange soda. My fingers wrapped around the cold glass like it was the only solid thing left in the room. From that corner, I could see nearly everything, and unfortunately, everyone could see me too. At first, the glances were brief, curious, then dismissive. Some eyes lingered just long enough to decide I wasn't worth another look. A few people assumed I was staff. One woman actually tried to hand me her empty glass before realizing I didn't work there. I smiled politely and stepped aside. Across the room, Dylan shone. He moved from group to group with practiced ease, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, shaking hands with people whose influence he craved. He was exactly where he believed he belonged. And then I saw her, Madison. She entered the ballroom like she already owned it. Her red dress caught every eye like an intentional flame. The cut hugged her figure perfectly. Her hair was styled into a sleek, professional bun that still managed to look seductive. Her heels clicked confidently across the marble floor as she greeted people with familiarity that felt deliberate. It took only seconds for Dylan to find her. They didn't even pretend it was coincidence. Their eyes met across the room. He smiled, she smiled back. And when they reached each other, his arms slipped around her waist with an ease that stabbed through my chest harder than any insult ever could. They looked like a picture, the ambitious man and the woman who matched his hunger. I watched as he poured her champagne, watched as she tilted her head close to his ear, and laughed at something he whispered, watched as his colleagues patted his shoulder in congratulations, and glanced at her with approval. No one questioned why she was there. No one questioned why she stood at his side, because in that world she fit, and I did not. A pair of junior employees approached the buffet. One of them looked at me hesitantly, her eyes soft with something close to pity. "Are you with the catering staff?" she asked awkwardly. "No," I replied gently. "Oh," she said, embarrassed. "Sorry." "It's fine," I said. She walked away quickly. I took a slow sip of the soda. It tasted overly sweet in my mouth. Across the room, I caught sight of Mr. Alvarez near the stage, speaking quietly with two board members. When our eyes met, he gave me a small, nearly imperceptible nod. I returned it just as subtly. I wasn't alone. But at that moment, I felt entirely isolated. The music grew louder, the conversations more animated, the room filled with the rhythm of success and illusion. Dylan was in his element, and then without meaning to, I drifted a few steps away from my corner. My glass was empty, my throat was dry. I turned toward a nearby table to set the glass down. That was when it happened. "James, sorry, Dylan," a deep voice called. "Mr. Miller," the assistant marketing director, the man Dylan had spoken about endlessly at the position he dreamed of reaching. Mr. Miller had noticed me. "Who is this?" he asked, gesturing slightly in my direction. "I don't believe I've seen her before." The laughter in the group quieted. Every conversation near us paused mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward me. Dylan froze. For a brief moment, I saw panic flicker across his face. He had options. He could have said, "She's my wife." He could have said, "She's family." He could have chosen any version of a half-truth and spared me the rest. But pride is a cruel thing. And ambition is even crueler. Dylan straightened his shoulders. A smile cold and careless touched his lips. "Oh, her," he said lightly. "That's Elena." He paused just long enough for the room to lean in. "She's my housekeeper. Very hard-working. I let her come tonight to help out in case anything comes up." The word hit me like a physical blow. Housekeeper. The air shifted. Someone let out a soft, uncomfortable laugh. Mr. Miller raised his eyebrows but said nothing. A few people exchanged glances, but no one corrected him. No one defended me. And Madison smiled, not politely, not awkwardly, triumphantly. She stepped closer to Dylan, sliding her hand up his arm in a slow, deliberate gesture. In fact, Dylan added smoothly, pulling her in closer. "This is Madison, my future wife." The room tilted. My future wife. Those 3 words shattered something irreparable inside me. Not just betrayal, erasure. In one sentence, he had reduced my existence to nothing. 2 years of marriage erased, 2 years of loyalty rewritten as servitude. I felt the blood drain from my fingers. For a moment, I couldn't feel my legs, but I did not cry. Not there, not for them, not for anyone. My gaze met Dylan's. He didn't look away. He looked relieved, as if a burden had been lifted from his chest, as if he had finally chosen the version of himself he wanted to be, and had no regrets about the cost. Madison's eyes met mine, and in them I saw everything: contempt, victory, a quiet enjoyment of my humiliation. I nodded once, not to them, to myself. Then I turned and walked away. The hallway outside the ballroom swallowed me in silence. The music softened behind closed doors as I leaned against the cool marble wall and finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, my knees weakened, and then the tears came. Not in delicate drops, in violent waves. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold floor, my arms wrapped tightly around my knees. I cried for the woman who had believed too easily. I cried for the wife who had tried too hard. I cried for the girl who once thought love alone was enough to protect her from being used. The words echoed in my head again and again. Housekeeper, future wife. Each repetition sharpened into something unbearable. I pressed my palm over my mouth to muffle the sound. My father's voice returned to me, soft but firm. When you're done crying, Elena, stand up. My breathing slowed, the sobs faded, and something else took shape beneath the pain, cold, focused, unforgiving. I reached for my phone. There was no hesitation. My fingers moved without trembling as I typed the only message that mattered. It's time. The screen glowed briefly. Delivered. I stood slowly. My reflection stared back at me from the polished marble eyes' red face, pale soul burning awake. I didn't fix my makeup. I didn't straighten my dress. I simply pulled the tie from my hair and let it fall freely down my back. Let them see me. Let them all see me. When I stepped back toward the ballroom, the music was still playing. Laughter still filled the air. Dylan was still smiling. Madison was still clinging to his arm. Neither of them knew that the story they believed they were writing had just reached its final turning point, and that this time I would be the one holding the pen. The moment I stepped back into the ballroom, something in the air shifted. At first, no one could explain why. The music hadn't changed yet. The lights were still soft and golden. Laughter still floated above the tables. Champagne still moved from tray to trembling hands. On the surface, everything was exactly as it had been moments ago. But people felt it. They turned their heads without knowing why. Conversations slowed. Eyes followed the quiet path I cut through the crowd. I walked differently now, not rushed, not hiding, not small. My back was straight, my steps were steady. My hair fell freely down my spine like a dark curtain of intention. The plain black dress no longer felt like a disguise. It felt like armor. Whispers rippled outward. Who is that woman? She looks different. Wasn't she standing by the buffet earlier? I didn't look at them. My eyes were fixed on the stage. Across the room, Dylan noticed the change before he understood it. His laughter faltered midway through a sentence. The glass in his hand hovered uncertainly. Madison followed his gaze and frowned. For a fraction of a second, fear crossed his face. I saw it. He felt it. Something was about to go wrong. At the foot of the stage, Miguel Alvarez was waiting. He stood tall and composed in his dark suit, the same posture he had held beside my father for decades. When his eyes met mine, there was no hesitation. Only respect, only certainty. "Everything is ready, Miss Rivera," he said quietly, offering his hand. Not Elena. Rivera. I took his hand without a word. The MC on stage was mid-joke, forcing laughter from a room that no longer knew why it was laughing. He faltered when he saw us approaching. Alvarez leaned in and whispered something into the man's ear. Whatever he said drained the color from the MC's face. The joke died unfinished on his tongue. Without question, he handed me the microphone and stepped back. The jazz band stopped playing. Lights dimmed. One single spotlight found me. The room fell into a silence so complete it felt heavy. Hundreds of faces turned upward. Dylan's breath caught in his throat. Madison's fingers tightened around his arm. I stood in the center of the stage, the microphone cool in my palm. For a moment, I said nothing. I let the quiet stretch. Let curiosity sharpen into unease. Let anticipation coil through the crowd like a held breath. Then I spoke. "Good evening." My voice echoed cleanly through the ballroom. Not trembling, not soft. Every syllable landed exactly where it was meant to. "Thank you for joining Rivera Holdings' annual gala tonight. This is a night meant to honor growth integrity and the people who carry this company forward every single day." Confusion spread across the room. Executives leaned toward one another. Board members exchanged quick glances. Who was I to speak like this? No one recognized the woman in the plain black dress, but everyone felt the authority in my voice. For many years, I continued this company. Has been defined by vision, by sacrifice, by values that were never meant to be compromised for convenience or ambition. My gaze swept through the room, slow and deliberate, until it landed where it had waited all night. Dylan. His face had gone pale. "I know most of you do not recognize me," I said. "That was intentional." The murmurs deepened. For the past 2 years, I stepped out of the public eye. I chose to see this company from the outside, from the ground, from the lives of people who build its success without always wearing titles that reflect their worth. The board shifted uneasily. Even Alvarez kept his eyes forward, allowing the moment to unfold as it was meant to. "My name is Elena Rivera." The reaction was almost imperceptible at first. One breath held too long, one chair drawn slightly back. Then recognition sparked like fire across dry leaves. "Daughter of Antonio Rivera," I added calmly, "and Carmen Rivera, the founders." The room broke. A collective gasp rippled outward. Glassware rattled. A director near the front dropped her champagne flute. It shattered quietly against the marble floor. "And for the past 2 years," I said, my voice steady, "I have been the majority owner and CEO of Rivera Holdings." Silence collapsed into the space between us. This time it was absolute. The older executives leaned forward in disbelief. Some stared openly, now their faces rearranging themselves as memory aligned with recognition. Whispers erupted near the front. "It's her. She looks just like Antonio. I can see it in her eyes." Across the ballroom, Dylan staggered backward a step. The meaning of every insult he had ever spoken bled together inside his mind. The woman whose breakfast he had mocked. The woman he had belittled for not understanding his world. The woman he had just called a housekeeper in front of his superiors. The woman he had erased in favor of another. His boss's boss, his career, his world, all of it. Madison's hand slipped from his arm as if burned. She stared at me in naked horror. Dylan turned to her, searching for something, anything that still made sense. She shook her head slowly. "I didn't know," she whispered. "You told me she was nothing." He couldn't answer. On the stage, I allowed the silence to breathe for 2 more seconds. Then I lifted the microphone again. I would have preferred, I said quietly, to remain invisible tonight. But circumstances made that impossible. My gaze returned to Dylan. Some matters became public by choice. A nervous shudder passed through the room. "James." I corrected myself, then continued evenly. "Dylan Brooks, His name through the speakers sounded like a verdict. He did not move. I hear you are a promising marketing manager, ambitious, well-liked, a man who understands the value of image. I paused. Yet tonight you demonstrated a complete lack of character. The room drew closer, like an audience instinctively leaning toward impact. I can forgive arrogance, I went on. I can forgive betrayal. I can even forgive ambition without conscience. Madison flinched beside him. But what I will never forgive, I said, my voice sharpening, is the deliberate humiliation of a woman you vowed to protect, the annihilation of a marriage for the sake of convenience, the use of this company's name and stage to parade infidelity as achievement. I felt no trembling, only calm, only truth. You introduced your wife as a housekeeper, I continued, and introduced your mistress as your future wife. In my company, under my roof, before my people. Dylan's mouth opened. No sound came out. In doing so, I said you violated company ethics, you violated basic human decency, and you disqualified yourself from standing in this organization. The world held still. Effective immediately, I said clearly, your employment with Rivera Holdings is terminated. The words did not echo, they struck. Dylan stumbled forward as if shoved by invisible hands. No, Elena, please, I can explain. There is nothing left to explain, I interrupted. Your explanation was already delivered to this room. I turned then. Madison Cole. She winced when her name cut through the air. You leveraged personal relationships for professional advancement. You pursued a married man within the workplace, and you stood here tonight enjoying the destruction of a home for your own gain. Her eyes filled with panic. Your contract is also terminated, immediately. The second fall came faster than the first. Security moved without hesitation. Two men approached Dylan and Madison calmly, firmly. Please accompany us, one said. Dylan didn't fight. He couldn't. Madison broke. She sobbed openly as they were guided through the parted crowd. No one blocked the path. No one defended them. All that remained was the long walk of consequence. The ballroom doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I exhaled. My apologies, I said quietly into the microphone. Let us return to the purpose of this evening. A breath passed. Then Alvarez stood. He began to clap, once, twice. Then the room rose with him. Thunderous applause filled the space, not for scandal, not for spectacle, but for clarity, for accountability, for a queen who had finally stepped back into her crown. As the night continued around me, I felt no triumph, only release. Freedom is not loud, it is silent, and it had finally found me. The ballroom doors closed behind them with a sound so soft it barely carried. But the silence it left behind was thunderous. For one suspended moment, no one moved. Applause was still echoing in the air, fading in slow, uneven waves, as if the room itself needed time to remember how to breathe again. Faces were pale with shock, eyes darting between the stage and the now closed doors. I stood exactly where I was. The spotlight had dimmed, but its warmth still lingered on my skin. Only when I lowered the microphone did my hands finally feel heavy. Alvarez stepped closer to me, his voice low and steady. It's over, I nodded. but I didn't feel like the scene had ended yet. Outside the ballroom, the world had turned colder. Dylan stumbled into the marble-floored lobby like a man who had been pushed out of a dream and into a nightmare he could no longer escape. The security guards released him only when they reached the edge of the private event zone. Their job was done. The damage would take care of itself. Madison's heels clicked unevenly as she walked. Her hands trembled. Mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark tracks, but she didn't seem to notice. She was too busy breathing in shallow, broken gasps. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The grand lobby of the Drake felt cavernous and empty now, stripped of its glamour. The gold light from the chandeliers reflected off polished floors that no longer felt celebratory, only exposed. "This is your fault," Madison suddenly screamed. Her voice cracked against the marble. She turned on Dylan with naked fury, her hands slamming against his chest in frantic blows. "You ruined everything. Everything you told me she was nothing. You told me she was just some poor nobody." He caught her wrists mid-strike. "My fault," he hissed. "You encouraged this. You said I needed to put her in her place. You liked it when I humiliated her." "I never told you to lie like that," she screamed back. "I never told you to introduce me as your future wife." "You wanted to be seen," he snapped. "You wanted everyone to know." Her laughter broke into something sharp and hysterical. "You idiot! I wanted status, not extinction." The words hung between them like broken glass. Dylan released her wrists slowly. His hands fell uselessly to his sides. The rage inside him collapsed under the weight of something much larger: fear. He reached for his phone with shaking fingers. One call to Elena, straight to voicemail, blocked. He tried again from Madison's phone, declined. The meaning crashed down on him with brutal clarity. This wasn't temporary, this was final. The valet from earlier stood near the entrance watching with unreadable eyes. Dylan recognized him. Only minutes ago he had stood there like a king. Now he lowered his gaze when he met the man's eyes. Madison staggered back 2 steps. "You destroyed my life," she whispered, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "You promised me a future, a penthouse, connections, power." Dylan laughed weakly. "You think I still have any of that?" he said. "They've turned me into a story, a warning. Do you know what happens to men like me after something like this?" She looked away. She already did. Without another word, Madison turned and walked toward the glass doors that led out onto Michigan Avenue. She did not look back. Dylan watched her disappear into the cold Chicago night. Then his strength gave out. He sank down onto the lobby floor, his expensive suit wrinkling beneath him, his head falling forward as his shoulders shook. For the first time in years, he cried, not for love, not for regret, but for loss, for power, for the future he had burned with his own hands. Inside the ballroom, a different atmosphere had taken root. The tension didn't vanish instantly, but it softened. Whispers turned into conversations again. The band cautiously resumed playing. Glasses were refilled. The rhythm of the evening, bruised but unbroken, slowly returned. Alvarez guided me down from the stage. Executives approached one by one. Some offered apologies for not recognizing me sooner. Some admitted they had suspected but never confirmed. Others simply bowed their heads in respect. Mr. Miller stood before me last. His voice was unsteady. "I owe you an apology, deeply. If I had known who you were, you would have treated me differently," I said gently. "And that is exactly why I chose to remain unseen." He lowered his eyes. "I understand now." Throughout the rest of the evening, I moved among them not as a spectacle, but as what I truly was. Their leader. We spoke of strategy, of markets, of expansion. I analyzed numbers without looking at notes. I described future projects with clarity that surprised even those who had known my name for decades. And in their eyes something shifted, not awe, trust. When the gala finally drew to a close, guests passed by to shake my hand as they left, one by one, some with awe, some with humility, some with a quiet admiration that needed no words. When the last of them had gone, I remained standing in the doorway, watching the ballroom empty until only the staff remained. Alvarez joined me with a soft sigh. "You carried yourself exactly like your father," he said. "He would be proud." I didn't answer, not yet. I left the Drake without fanfare. No cameras, no waiting press, just a quiet black car waiting at the curb. As the driver pulled away, Chicago unfolded beyond the window in streaks of gold and shadow. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, the weight was gone. The car drove north, past familiar intersections, past streets I used to avoid, past the world I had abandoned. The iron gate of the Rivera estate opened slowly at my approach. 2 years of dust lay softly on marble and glass. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was waiting. As I stepped inside, the lights activated automatically, illuminating halls lined with family portraits and history. My parents' faces looked down at me from their frames. For a long moment, I simply stood there. Then finally I spoke. "I'm home." 3 months passed. Winter surrendered to early spring. And Rivera Holdings did not falter, it rose. Under my direction, the company expanded into 2 new digital markets. We restructured internal ethics policies. We introduced new executive oversight. Confidence returned where scandal had briefly cast its shadow. I no longer hid, and no one asked me to. One afternoon, Alvarez entered my office, carrying a thick envelope. The last of the legal filings, he said quietly. "Your divorce has been finalized." I opened the folder. My name, Dylan's name, 2 signatures, 2 endings. I signed without hesitation. When I placed the pen down, there was no pain, only relief. "Any news of them?" I asked calmly. Alvarez hesitated. "Dylan was forced to sell his car. He's moved back in with his parents in Indiana. No company in Chicago will touch him." Madison found work as an administrative assistant at a small firm in the suburbs. I nodded once. "Then the matter is closed." That evening I stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office atop Rivera Tower. Chicago glowed beneath me. A million lives, a million choices, some built, some broken. I thought of the woman who once folded laundry in a small Logan Square apartment, wondering when her heart had begun to disappear. And I smiled, not with revenge, with recognition. I had not destroyed anyone. I had only stopped destroying myself. 3 months after the gala, the city no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like home. Spring had settled gently over Chicago. softening the hard edges of steel and concrete with pale blue skies and budding trees. From the top floor of Rivera Tower, I watched the river below catch the morning light in broken ribbons of silver. Boats drifted slowly beneath the bridges. Traffic moved with its usual impatience. Life continued unaware of the quiet war that had ended and the woman who had survived it. In the conference room behind me, voices were rising, focused, energetic, alive with momentum. Digital expansion into the Southeast will require a stronger local marketing arm, one executive said. We already have the talent, another countered. What we need is strategic leadership on the ground. Then we build it, I said, stepping into the room. Not from the top down, from the inside out. The room fell silent for just a second. Not with hesitation, only with attention. Every face turned toward me. They listened, truly listened. 3 months ago, some of them had only known my name on paper. Now they knew my voice, my decisions, my standards. They had seen me challenge projections, rewrite systems, reject shortcuts, and demand accountability with a calm that left no room for negotiation. The timid woman who once apologized for existing was gone. The woman standing at the head of that table belonged there. When the meeting ended, the executives filed out, one by one, nodding in quiet respect. Alvarez lingered behind. You handled that beautifully, he said. I smiled faintly. They handled it beautifully. I'm just guiding the current. He studied me for a moment. Your father used to say the same thing. After he left, I returned to my office. Sunlight stretched across the floor. The city breathed quietly beyond the glass. On my desk lay a simple brown envelope. I already knew what it was. The divorce papers had been finalized weeks ago, but I had avoided opening them, not out of fear, out of something quieter, something reflective, a need to let the chapter close in its own time. I slit the envelope slowly. Dylan's name stared back at me from the page. So familiar, so distant. There was no dramatic rush of emotion, no surge of anger, no sorrow, just an odd sense of recognition, like seeing the shadow of a person I once loved, now completely separated from who he had become. I signed my name, Elena Rivera. The pen moved smooth and steady. With that single motion, the last thread was cut. When Alvarez returned later, I handed him the folder. It's done, I said simply. He nodded. Would you like an update? I considered the question for only a moment. Yes, Dylan left Indiana for a while, tried applying out of state. The story followed him. He's now working part-time at a logistics warehouse, far from marketing, far from offices. Madison moved again. She's freelancing now, no stable footing. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I said quietly, I wish them both whatever peace they are capable of finding. And I meant it, because revenge had not been the point, freedom had. That evening, instead of returning to a crowded penthouse or an empty apartment, I drove alone along the lakefront. The water stretched endlessly beside the road, catching the dying light of the sun. I lowered the windows. The wind moved through my hair, freely unrestrained. For years I had tied myself into careful knots to fit into someone else's expectations. Now I didn't need to be small for anyone. When I arrived at the Rivera estate, the gates opened without delay. The house no longer felt like a ghost of my past. It had become a living part of my present. Inside, the lights glowed warmly against polished wood and stone. The echoes of old memories no longer felt heavy. They felt grounded. In the kitchen, I rolled up my sleeves and cooked for myself, not out of obligation, out of choice. I scrambled eggs the way I liked them, slightly browned at the edges. I brewed coffee stronger than Dylan ever preferred. I set the plate down at the long dining table and sat alone, the quiet surrounding me, not with loneliness, but with space. Space to breathe, space to think. I ate slowly, listening to the hum of the house, to the sound of my own existence unfolding without judgment. Later that night, I stood on the balcony overlooking the dark stretch of the lake. The stars reflected faintly on the water. The world felt vast again, not threatening, just open. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to choose me. I had chosen myself. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were steady, and that steadiness was its own kind of miracle. I rebuilt relationships that had grown distant during my years in hiding. I visited the bookstore near DePaul once quietly without announcement. The owner hugged me when she recognized me. She didn't ask why I had left. She didn't ask where I had gone. She only said she was glad I was alive. I was. Alive in a way I had forgotten was possible. One afternoon, as spring deepened into warmth, I walked through downtown without an entourage, without a driver, just me and the city. No one bowed, no one stared. And for once, that anonymity felt like a gift, not a cage. At a quiet intersection, I paused at a crosswalk and caught my reflection in a storefront window. The woman looking back at me was composed, grounded, awake. She had scars, she had strength, she had a future that no longer depended on anyone else's ambition. When the light changed, I crossed the street without looking over my shoulder. That night, in the stillness of my bedroom, I lay awake not with anxiety, but with clarity. I thought about love, not the version that demands sacrifice disguised as devotion. Not the version that grows fat on silence and compliance, but the kind that stands beside you without asking you to kneel first. I didn't know when or if that love might come again. And for the first time in my life, I was completely at peace with not knowing, because I no longer measured my worth by the hands that held me. I measured it by the way I stood when those hands were gone. In the mirror, I brushed my hair slowly and met my own gaze. No makeup to hide behind, no mask to protect me. Just a woman who had walked through fire and emerged without asking permission to shine. I turned off the light. Chicago slept beneath me, restless and alive. And somewhere beyond the quiet horizon, another morning was already preparing to rise. Not as redemption, not as revenge, but as continuation. And this time I would walk into it without looking back.